All right, everyone, let's talk about throttle and brakes for a little bit. So whenever I'm on the gas, I'm rolling on the throttle like this. I'm not worried about my fingers touching the brake while I'm on the gas because obviously as I'm rolling on the throttle, my fingers are getting pulled back and it may not even be touching the brake. That's perfectly okay. But what matters is whenever you roll off the throttle, don't do this. Don't roll off the throttle and have your fingers way down here. So whenever you roll off the throttle, naturally let your fingers go up to the brakes, even if you're not using the brakes. Better to have your fingers up there just in case. But whenever you're riding around, if your fingers aren't touching the brakes, that's fine. A lot of people think they have to get adjustable levers and put the lever very, very close to the handlebar because like, oh, I can't touch the brake at all times. Well, you don't need to touch the brake at all times because you're never on the gas and trying to use the brake at the same time. So no matter how small your hands are, here's what you need to do. So you're on the throttle. If your fingers are small, as you roll off the throttle, look at my wrist. I reach up and I bring my wrist up. It ensures I go to 0% throttle, and look how far I could reach with my fingers. And it's actually a very common mistake. People have their brake lever adjusted way too closely. And you'll know this by, if you ever go practice emergency braking, which a lot of people don't do, but you should, to get used to the brakes and how strong they are. If you're squeezed in the brakes and the lever hits your fingers or your gloves before you get to 100% brake lever or brake pressure, your lever's too close. So a lot of people have it way too close. You need to adjust it and put it a little bit further away. So that way when you get on the brakes, you can actually get all of the brakes power out of it before having to add more fingers or do whatever. So most bikes, you can use 2 fingers if adjusted properly, and the brakes are good enough to where you can stop the bike. Unless you have really crappy brakes or a big, huge, heavy bike and crappy brakes, Harley, or whatever, then you might need all 4 fingers to actually get the thing to stop. That's a little bit different. But either way, most modern bikes with good brakes, all you need is 2 fingers if the lever is adjusted the right way. So once again, you're rolling on the throttle, you're going down, your fingers may not even touching the brake, that's fine. But as you roll off the throttle, right, have your fingers automatically go up to those brakes, even if you're not using them. So that way, just in case something happens mid-turn, there's no reaction time. You just start squeezing the brake, on and off the brake pressure, whatever you need to do, back on the throttle, on the brake a little bit, you could adjust very easily. The problem is having your hand like this. Now if something happens, you have to reach up, and to try to make up for that reaction time delay that you had, you'll probably give it way too much brake right away, grab it, cause a crash. You see what I'm saying? So this is especially true for cornering. You're out on the twisty mountain roads. If you roll off the throttle and your fingers like this, I think you're absolutely nuts. So first of all, if something were to happen, that reaction time, you're gonna give it way too much and it's gonna be a bad day. So whenever you roll off the throttle, have your fingers just naturally go up to the brake. And then if you need to use just a little bit of brake pressure, that's fine. Take away, add, you could do it, no problem, because your fingers are already there. Plus you have 3 fingers still wrapped around the throttle to control the bike, steer it, and work on the throttle. But do not have your fingers completely wrapped around the throttle like this as you roll off the throttle, especially in the twisty mountain roads, especially for blind corners. If you do anything for blind turns, especially as you roll off the throttle, just naturally let your fingers go up to that brake lever. And like I said about emergency braking, you can have the best brakes in the world, but if you don't practice what these brakes are capable and practice stopping very quickly, it's going to be irrelevant anyway. So I recommend go into a parking lot, go into a dead-end road, somewhere where it's pretty clean pavement, 20 miles per hour second gear, you should easily be able to stop back in first gear 15 feet or less. So 20 miles per hour, pick a crack on the ground or put up a soda can or a rock. Once your front tire gets to that marker, wherever it is, you should be able to stop as quickly. You should be able to stop 15 feet or less and be back in first gear before you stop, right, from 20 miles per hour, no problem. So it's a squeeze of the front brake. You're never grabbing the brake. And I don't care if your bike has ABS or not, the technique is the same. As you're going down 20 miles per hour, you reach up, you start to get on the brake very softly at first, just the first tiny little bit to get the suspension to set. Once that happens, then you can build up the pressure a whole lot. So think about the front brake as an orange, right? You're squeezing the juice out of the orange. You see that? You reach up and you squeeze the juice out of the orange. As the suspension collapses, all the weight goes to the front tire, providing all that grip. All the weight of the bike collapses down, goes onto that front tire. That's why the front brake is so much more powerful than the rear, because all the weight of the motorcycle goes on top of it, smashing that front tire down into that front tire, right? All the weight smashing the front tire into the ground. Plus, you have bigger rotors up front. You have two discs up front. The brakes are better, everything else. And that's why the rear brake is so much less powerful because all the weight is going forward onto that front tire. You see what I'm saying? No matter what bike you have. So the technique is, as you roll off the throttle, get on the brake, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 90, 100. But you should be at 100% braking by the time you come to a stop. Again, if you're not stopping 15 feet or less at 20 miles per hour, that's bad. Like, you should be able to stop easily 15 feet or less at 20 miles per hour. So get out there and go practice. So that's the front brake, right? Smooth, increasing pressure. Are you struggling to become a better rider? Do you want to challenge yourself to go above and beyond the basics? Then MotoJitsu Master Riding Program is for you. Full of drills you could set up on your own. All you need is a parking lot and some cones and a tape measure. Both of these books with all of my drills is also in my MotoJitsu app. Look in the description below for the links to my books and my app, and get out there and practice. So you're not just being a basic. Reach up 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 90, 100. It's not a grab. You don't want to overload anything, because the reason why grabbing is bad, no matter if you have ABS or not, you're going to overwhelm the front suspension and tires without weight on it. So you have to wait for the weight, just like they say in champ school whenever you're trail braking. So as you go 5, 10, 15, 20, that first initial squeeze gets the suspension to collapse, and then the weight could go onto the front tire, providing all the grip so you could squeeze more. So it's just a little bit soft in the very beginning, and it takes practice to do this. You can't just watch a video, read a book, and be like, okay, now I'm awesome at it. No, you have to go practice a lot. And I recommend practicing every single time you leave your house. Go do 3 or 4 emergency braking. Start at 5 miles per hour, 10 miles per hour, 15, work your way up to 20 miles per hour. Warms up your tires. Make sure your bike isn't broken. Warms yourself up mentally, just in case you go to the next intersection, someone pulls out in front of you, you know the brakes work, you know what that squeeze feels like. So practice a lot of practice. So smooth, increasing pressure on that front brake, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 90, 100, just like an orange, squeeze in the orange, squeeze that front brake all the way down, practice. And that's the front brake. The rear brake is the exact opposite technique. So as the weight is going forward, there's less and less weight on the rear of the bike, right? Because the weight's going forward. So the rear brake technique is you start off with a little bit of brake pressure, but then you taper off. The rear brake technique is light. You start off with a little bit of pressure, light pressure, and then you go to lighter. You go more and more with the front, less with the rear. Because if you just push down and just keep on adding more and more pressure, you're gonna skid the rear tire. Again, if you have ABS, then it may not skid, but if you're practicing and your rear ABS ever engages, you have a personal coach built into your bike, and that is telling you you're using too much rear brake. The rear ABS should never engage because you're going light to lighter. And on any type of sport touring bike, sport bike, naked sport bike, it's 100% front brake. Because if you have good grip on the tires, good grip on the ground, and you're practicing all the way to 100%, the rear tire is going to be damn near off the ground at the very end of the stop. And how useful is the rear brake when the tire's not even on the ground? Or if there's barely any weight on the rear tire, say it's still on the ground, but there's almost no weight on top of it, again, the rear tire is almost the rear brake is almost useless. So unless you're on a big, huge, heavy cruiser, then maybe a little bit more pressure can be used on the rear. But no matter what bike, this is the point, no matter what bike, it is still 70, 80% of all stopping power of any bike you have up in that front brake. But you can have the best Brembo amazing brakes you have. If you do not practice, it's going to be pointless when it actually comes to stopping very quickly. And the only thing you do, whatever you do when a car pulls out in front of you is going to be what you're used to. If the only thing you ever practice or you're ever used to doing something like that is like, oh, I don't practice, so I'm just going to panic. Well, the only thing you're going to be left with is panic. I'd rather be left with the technique and the muscle memory of squeezing the front brake, understanding what that suspension feels like, and it dives down. How you need to squeeze the tank as much as you're squeezing the front brake so your arms don't get too loaded, right? So all these things matter, and all these things you'll learn by practicing emergency braking. And the more comfortable you get with the front brake, the better your overall riding will be. A lot of people have issue going quicker because they don't know how to slow down. Like, why would you go fast if you can't stop fast? So I promise you, the number one thing to practice and focus on is the front brake. If you took off my front brake, this is how important it is. If you took off my front brake, I would be afraid to ride around the block, because if something were to happen, that little tiny rear brake is not going to stop me very quickly. I'd be afraid to go over 20 miles per hour if I didn't have a front brake. That's how important it is. And if that is not your mentality, and you don't know that through continuous experimentation and practice with the front brake, emergency braking, you just don't understand that. And all you're doing is hoping nothing happens. Hope is not a technique. practice with the front brake. Even if it's just going down the road, you have a couple blocks before you get to the highway and start riding, whatever you need to do. There's no one behind you. Just practice, get on that front brake, stopping as quickly as you can, understanding what that feels like to have that weight drop and get all that weight onto the front tire. And then next time you're at a parking lot, so every parking space is 8 feet. So just, you don't need cones or need a stopper, anything like that. You don't even need to measure anything. Go to a mall where parking spaces are 8 feet. Just go down the mall, pick one line to start begin braking at 20 miles per hour. You should be able to stop before the second line because 8 and 8, 16 feet. So you should be able to stop within 2 parking spaces at 20 miles per hour. If you can't do that, you are very, very lucky nothing is happening because you have no idea what you're doing. And once again, I don't care if you have ABS, I don't care if you have traction control, anti-lift, whatever. This bike with ABS, that rear tire will still come off the ground, right? So just understand, I don't care what technology you have, the technique is what to understand, the technique is what to practice. Because say I sell this bike, I buy a different bike, I'm on an e-bicycle that has a front brake and there's no ABS on that thing. If you grab the front brake on that bike, you will absolutely front flip. You borrow someone else's bike, you rent a bike for a week to go on a road trip. You go to a track bike where it doesn't have ABS. All these different things, if you're only relying on technology to save you, you are setting yourself up for failure. If you disconnected and cut every single ABS thing out of this bike, I would not care at all. I wouldn't even know it. And I wouldn't change the way I ride. I wouldn't change the pace. I wouldn't change the techniques. Nothing would change because technology does not matter. You should be focusing on learning and practicing the technique. Then technology is like a safety blanket in case all else fails, right? Then, okay, maybe it could help you out. But if you don't focus on learning the technique, it doesn't matter what technology you have. ABS does not mean anti-crash. It's just a safety blanket. It is not the number one thing to be relied upon, and that's the big problem, right? So practice with the front brake. Practice rolling off the throttle, having your fingers covering the front brake whenever you're going through turns. And more important than anything, practice emergency braking. And that's just 20 miles per hour. Once you get really proficient at that, bump up the speed. 30 miles per hour, 40, 50 miles per hour. Practicing fourth gear, 50 miles per hour. Practicing downshifting to first before you come to a stop. And see how long it takes you to actually come to a stop at 50 miles per hour. A lot of people never do that in their lives. They have a very, very false sense of security about how well they could stop and what their technique is. Because if you only practice emergency braking at some course to get your license years ago, you're just hoping nothing happens, and hope is not a technique. Get out there and practice with that front brake. It is the most important thing you could do on a motorcycle.